Perfect. Well, thanks for coming out after lunch. I'm sure everyone's kind of quite full, so we'll try and keep you as entertained as possible. So I'm Hollie.
I'm Jivan.
We work for an agency called Fjord in London. It's a design agency. I'm a user experience designer by trade.
And I'm a data scientist.
Cool, so we're going to be talking to you about designing ethical AI, the considerations, the arguments for it, and why it's down to all of us to actually take responsibility and do something about it. And we hope by the end of the talk we'll have given you some things to think about, as well as some options for how you can actually find out more and sort of practical steps you can take to investigate this area kind of on your own and expand your learning.
So obviously, while data science and machine learning aren't really new fields, interest in these topics has risen exponentially over the past sort of 5 to 10 years. And there's a lot of hope around what data can do for our society and our businesses. But I think until relatively recently, the public hasn't really been aware of the potential ramifications that data can have on our lives. So technology has kind of been used in unforeseen ways with repercussions on society that we haven't really anticipated. So the really key example of this is the fake news on Facebook and Twitter and the influence this had on the 2016 US elections. So I think tech companies have been quite sort of slow to recognize and also do anything about the fact that their work can be used for nefarious kind of purposes. And I think people are becoming more aware that even though they make some really cool products, they might not have society's best interests at heart.
Cool. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how sci-fi is reflected in kind of our lives now. And I think we all sort of recognise the utopian futures of sort of sci-fi from the 1960s, and these sort of images from NASA of actually kind of the possible worlds that we could be living in and how it could be a very equal and happy society. And actually, that's not really played out in our lives at the moment. We found that people are actually lonelier, so we've got a younger generation feeling more unhappy, more lonely, less connected, although theoretically we're hugely connected, less satisfied, so kind of everyone really feels like they want something that's very personalised and tailored to them continuously. It's what we've come to expect, and whenever you don't have that, there's kind of this gap in between that and what makes you happy, and we're actually less productive. So I don't know if anyone here actually checked their email during the lunch break. Anyone? Yeah? Okay, cool. This is my point, is that you're not switched off at any time. We have all these things that were supposed to make us kind of more accessible, easy to get to, but actually the flip side of that is now we work more because we're on all the time. There's no switching off. You're on holiday and you're there like, oh, I should just check my work email because I've got 5 minutes. And that's actually a really negative thing that we've seen happening. In UX and design in particular, the sort of ethical debate's been going on for a little while, and I think some of you might be quite aware of dark patterns and these sort of systems and interactions that we've put in place that actually get people to behave in a certain way. So a lot of UX now is very focused on behavioural science and actually how we can use that to tailor experiences for people. And I think we're seeing that more and more kind of using algorithmic processes to actually make it an audience of one. And it becomes much more tailored in that kind of behavioural change that we're trying to do. And those dark patterns that we've put in place are just amplified for us throughout these different systems that we have.
Yeah, so with all these sort of dark patterns and fake news, we can see that technology kind of creates as many problems as it does solutions. And even among sort of big names in the field like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, there's a lot of debate over whether AI is sort of the best thing or the worst thing for us as humans. And I kind of feel like even though they have different perspectives, some hilarious comments like, Mark's understanding of the subject is limited.
Which is an amazing burn.
Even though they sort of disagree, they're both actually funding this technology, so they clearly believe in the progress that it'll bring. And in a way, it's really great that they're having this debate because it means it's sort of out there. So obviously, it's really important to be aware of the potential negatives, but it's also really cool that sort of technology is advancing so rapidly, and we live in a completely different world to where we lived 25 years ago even. So I think sort of while cool, a new problem with this is that sort of regulation and law hasn't been very quick to catch up with technology. And, you know, we see this all the time in the news. Uber gets told to stop operating in London. Airbnb is blamed for a housing crisis. You see extremist content on Facebook and Twitter. And there isn't really much that we can do about it from a legal standpoint, even though we do try. So I think it's very much up to us as a society to create standards for technology that we hold ourselves up to.
Cool. So that kind of brings us on to our main point. So we're going to advocate for becoming not only more human-centered in the design patterns that we use, but actually humanity-centered. So a lot of you will probably be familiar with sort of user-centered design processes, actually finding the need before you actually try to solve a problem. And in terms of understanding that human behavior and making sure that we're kind of making things easier for people, and also making sure we balance those user needs against the business needs. But then we also need to think about humanity in our societies as a whole. So in some ways, if we think about this, it's almost if your product or service, whatever you're working on, everyone in the world adopts it, which is amazing, right? But the issue with that is there can be these unintended consequences through scale. And it's the kind of what happens if everyone uses it, who does it exclude, what's going on with that? How do we actually mitigate for those issues where it's actually incredible success commercially, but socially may not actually have such good connotations. So for us, it's about keeping both of those elements kind of in place. And there are three key areas that we think we need to look at to make sure that we're designing both for users and for humanity. And that's kind of fair and transparent data science, looking at trust and human-machine collaboration, so whether that's automation in the future of work, or whether it's actually thinking about AI as a teammate that we really want to befriend and how we make that friendship possible, down to responsibility and accountability. So where does it lie? Is it with the human? Is it with the machine? So we're going to talk you through some of those issues and hopefully give you some good ideas for debate.
Yep. So the first thing we're going to talk about is fair and transparent data science. So obviously, organizations, companies, governments, everyone is really keen to use data science in, automating processes and helping decision making. And this means that these things have a lot of influence over our day-to-day lives. So, they determine whether you get a job or get a mortgage or how much your insurance costs. So they're really sort of prevalent in our day-to-day. And the problem around this is that these models that make these decisions are often black boxes. So this sort of brings to light the issue around truth and trust. And if we can't understand sort of the reasons behind a decision or a prediction made by a model, how do we know we can trust it? And if it goes wrong, how do we explain it when people start asking what happened? So I think when we talk about explainable AI, a big thing that often comes up is the trade-off between interpretability and performance. So basically, as the data scientists in the room will know, as models get more accurate, they get less explainable. And I think sort of as data scientists, we use accuracy as a measure of success for ourselves, but we don't really use explainability at all. So maybe it needs to sort of be added into our success criteria when we talk about sort of the work we're doing as a data science team. And sort of, the reason explainability is important is because it can help us sort of bring to light these unintended consequences that often only come up after the fact. So if we make it sort of a standard component to consider in our work, it's something we might be able to preempt, essentially. So a really famous case of this is the COMPAS algorithm, which was used in the US to determine if a defendant was likely to reoffend. And there was a lot of media sort of outcry about it because it was shown to be racially biased. And while it didn't actually take into account race directly, it was using other factors like postcode as a proxy for race. So it's sort of a lot of these problems occur, and you know about it sort of afterwards, and you can explain it later. But if we can get to a point where we can explain them sort of beforehand, we can hopefully avoid this type of sort of issue. And sort of the good news here is essentially that it's not an impossible problem. There are methods for explainability. So there's models that are themselves somewhat interpretable, and then there's models that can be used to interrogate other models that tend to be more of black boxes. And the point of this is not to go through a technical explanation of any of these. I think there are other talks for that at this conference, but it's more to emphasize the fact that they exist and we need to make it a standard practice to start interrogating the models that we're using, particularly when they relate to people and personal data. And sort of as data scientists, we can use those models to start looking into explainability, but actually we need to go a step further and translate this for a non-technical audience in a very human way. So I kind of think this is a nice quote by Arthur C. Clarke. So any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But actually, we don't want to have blind faith in technology and view it as magic. We need to be sort of aware and have a level of understanding because technology is so prevalent in our day-to-day lives. So an example I kind of like that sort of reveals that we don't quite have this understanding is from a podcast called Reply All. And there's an episode called Is Facebook Spying on You? And basically, in the episode, people present all this anecdotal evidence about talking about random products, and they see ads for these products on their Facebook feed. And I've definitely seen ads for things I've talked about on Facebook or social media, and I'm sure everyone else here has been like, where has that creepy ad come from? I swear I've never typed this into Google, but it's somehow there and it knows. So obviously on the podcast, everyone sort of suspected that Facebook was listening into their conversations, and the hosts sort of went through a bit of an investigation and discovered that essentially it wasn't listening in, supposedly. It was more Facebook was finding these things about you through an application called Pixel, where it sort of follows you around the internet. So sort of that was the explanation, but there's still this lingering suspicion that they're listening in because it's still really not quite clear how all of that works. So it's sort of, it's still not quite as transparent as it should be, I think. So in addition to sort of being able to explain these decisions and all these things that we see around us, I think another part of sort of understanding technology and the context that sort of it lives in is about machines being a bit more humble. So what I mean by this is even if sort of a model isn't sure about something, it doesn't always admit it. So this creates this illusion around, accuracy and truth, right? And again, this isn't an impossible problem. We can calculate a confidence level and show it to our users, but we don't always do that. And I think if a machine sort of appears to be more humble and modest in the decisions it makes, it will make it a lot easier for us to question it as opposed to being sort of a source of mathematical perfection and truth. So I think that's just sort of another thing we need to consider when we're designing in sort of this transparency and fairness. So transparency, clearly really key to trust from what we've talked about so far. And I think it's, as I sort of said, it's not a given. Like, transparency doesn't just occur. You really need to make a conscious effort to design it in, whether it's through explainability or humbleness. So I think it's very much something that is up to us to include when we're building these systems that are ever increasing in our lives.
Cool, and then transparency is one of those key elements to actually building trust, and one of the areas that we need to do that most in is around the future of work and human-machine collaboration. So we see lots of kind of things in the news where people are very worried. This is one of those sort of headlines. So this is from a McKinsey report that 800 million jobs will be lost to automation by 2030. So there are sort of these things kind of playing out across mainstream media, and actually there's much more to the story than that. So we know that technology may destroy a particular job, but it doesn't actually destroy work. So I don't know if anyone here has a job that would have been exactly the same job 20 years ago or even existed. Nope. So we've all got jobs that were created by technology in the future that we're living in. Me in particular, like UX is a very new field, data science I think as well in its current form is quite new. And we've seen these things play out before, and this time it almost seems like it's this sort of sort of like fear from things like sci-fi and these like terrifying androids that are coming to get us and they're going to replace our jobs and we'll have these robot chefs. But actually, the positive side of it's just as important for us to actually be having that conversation. So we need to be sort of highlighting those things to people. And, you know, there are jobs that never existed, things like SEO experts, which also I think has gone away now. But there are lots of these things that have kind of come up, bubbled up, and then they change and shift over time. But I did double check if we would have jobs, because there is an algorithm to check. And I was looking at statistician was the nearest thing to data science. Unfortunately, data science wasn't on there, but apparently around a 20% chance of being automated. It's from an Oxford study. Developers or development itself was actually around 40%. So there are quite different skill sets that are involved in different pieces of this. And I think design was very similar to statistician. So the more you're dealing with creativity or actually management of people, the less likely it is that you will be automated. So it's actually about, there will be these new jobs. They may be more in those sort of areas than the areas they are at the moment. So it's actually completely false that AI is going to replace our workforce. We should actually think about it as giving us superpowers or giving us new jobs or enabling us to kind of achieve our dreams. And we need to be reframing the conversation in that way. One of the key areas of this is actually human-machine collaboration. So there's not so many studies on this done yet, but this is a really good one that's from Harvard University that was looking at the ability of expert doctors to diagnose cancer, and the ability of AI software to do it. So alone, the doctors were actually performing better than the machine, but together they increased their level of accuracy to an incredible level that it was nearly perfectly accurate. So again, it had sped it up, but it had also made it more accurate in the way that they were doing it. So it's something that we need to think about more as to how we can build these hybrid systems that are actually enhancing human potential rather than taking away from us and taking over our work. And we'll come back to the element of trust. So this is an idea about trust that's very based on kind of human-to-human interaction. But I think it's just as relevant for AI or for business. So it's the idea that basically if your self-interest outweighs any of the kind of pieces above, so your credibility is obviously your expertise, the years that you've been working in something, how much knowledge someone believes you have in it, your reliability being how well you can perform a task repeatedly, which is particularly prevalent when we're talking about more machine-based systems. And authenticity is the one that's a little bit more difficult to translate. For humans, it's almost kind of how authentic someone feels you are and how comfortable they are with you. So it's kind of a comfort level. And if your self-interest appears to outweigh your skills in any of the above, then they won't actually trust you. So we need to kind of build in these things to allow people to trust the machines that we're going to be having relationships with. So that relationship could be fully augmented. So it'll be these like superhumans with our superpowers, or it might be fully intelligent agents. So sometimes it's actually better if the machine does all the work and we're not integrated with it, but we need to actually make that assessment about which is which. So this is kind of a framework that we've been working on to do that. So it's kind of based on these different areas. So you assess a level of problem complexity. So is it a bounded problem? Is it an open-ended problem? How autonomous is the decision-making in it? So can a machine make a decision independently from a human? Can a human make that decision independently from the machine? Or are they collaborating together to make the decisions? Is it management by exception? So the human's only alerted when things go outside of a normal kind of bounded range. And also the consequence of failure. So this one, I think, could be split up into a few different areas. This one's more about consequence of failure on society, but there's also consequence of failure on a business or on the specific users. So if we think about some specific examples I'll go through with you in a minute, you'll see that there's some sort of different levels there. And the key one is actually, where does the responsibility lie? So are we going to put the responsibility on humans in this hybrid system, or does it fully lie with the machine? Who's going to take that accountability? So this is an example of that applied to content moderation. So if you think about something like a social network where there's extremist content that we don't want people to be seeing, it's a very nasty job for someone to actually have to moderate that. It's a really good use case to actually have AI involved in that system and kind of eliminate some of those very obvious ones before the human has to interact with it. So in terms of that, it's a pretty open-ended problem. There are lots of different examples of there for it. It's a continuous engagement. The machine's alerting the human whenever something it's not sure about. It's telling the human to, this needs a human check. And so in terms of responsibility, it's actually the human is the last kind of point of call to actually decide what's going on with it. Whereas this one is for a movie recommendation service. So this is much more automated. So the problem is kind of more contained. The autonomy is very high, so the algorithms making those decisions independently. And the consequence of failure here is quite negligible in terms of sort of society or the effect it's going to have on a person. In terms of a business, I'd argue it's maybe quite different. If you've built your business on the power of your recommendations and actually people continuously watching your content through that, there's some debate there. This is an example of one where it went catastrophically wrong. So I don't know if you guys know the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. It's basically, I think from back in the 70s, there was a pressure valve that was stuck open. Due to the valve being stuck open, lots of alerts were going off in the control center. The humans got very worried about it because obviously flashing lights need to do something. And so they intervened in the problem, whereas actually had they not intervened, the system itself would have self-regulated. So a catastrophic error was caused by the fact that the feedback loop in terms of the human-machine interaction wasn't there and it wasn't at the right level. So if we're kind of in these hybrid systems, then we should think of them as one of our team and we should play to our strengths. And if we think about what the strengths of AI is over what the strengths of humans are, ours can be more around the sort of empathetic stance, the creativity stance, and actually what can we do with that and sort of make sure that we're in our team designing the AI so it's the best team member for our team and we're the best team members for it as well. So there's kind of this sort of two-way street. If we start to give sort of machines a bit more personality and actually think about them as having those same qualities that we would see in a teammate, what is it that you value? Is it their level of responsibility? Is it the fact that they've got a really good sense of humor? There are lots of like human qualities or communication, for example. So that comes back to the transparency in an AI. If we value communication among our team, then we need to have the AI, a part of our team, actually being very transparent about the decisions it's making, so it's communicating very effectively with us. So this is something that I do think we need to be aware of as well, is that there is a possibility that software is going to be able to code better than we can. So what do we kind of do about that? We've at the moment got, we have an education system that is putting a lot of kind of emphasis on children learning these types of skills, which is the issue we have in a labour force right now, but isn't necessarily the issue that we'll have in 5 to 10 years' time when those people actually reach the labour force. And are starting to work. So it's not about people not necessarily learning to code, it's actually about what are the best things for them to learn. And if it's, the languages at the moment are quite abstracted away from sort of base level computing and they make them very accessible to people, which is amazing. So lots of people can get involved. But actually if we reach the point where the machine can do that better than we can, should we not be learning the more complex ones that are actually the underlying sort of the processor power and the systems that we're using to actually do that? And maybe we do need to think about a sort of shift towards empathetic learning as well as those more complex computer skills for people. So I would pose that automation could actually make us more human. If we think about sort of the filter bubbles and things that have been coming up with social media lately, if we live in these contained worlds, having a high level of empathy is really important to understand people within another contained world. And if we're not teaching and not valuing those skill sets in our children and people going forward, we're just exponentially kind of increasing that problem because we're already seeing kind of things like the rise of the alt-right and the far left and people just not really being able to understand each other's point of view. I think Brexit's probably a really good example where everyone in London was like, what the fuck just happened? How is this like going on? And actually having empathy and understanding what's going on with other people and how their lives might be different from yours maybe would have had people kind of question that a little bit more and it wouldn't have been such a surprise. So for us, it's not really kind of, if we compete against the machines and the things that the machines are really good at, we're going to lose against them because they're just going to get more powerful and better. So actually, what are the areas we can compete in that we can kind of amplify the skills of a machine and they can amplify our skills and we're working kind of as one unit?
So while we do need to be working very much with the machines, we also need to keep in mind that we're the ones that are ultimately responsible for these systems. So a few years ago, ethics in data science wouldn't have really even been a topic to talk about among data scientists, let alone the general public. But because of sort of recent events that have been quite prominent in the media, like Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, etc., the general public's much more sort of aware of the power of data and the ethical concerns that come along with this. So obviously ethical standards do exist in science. but they haven't really been applied to data science. So in a scientific study, typically research participants need to give informed consent. So basically they need to have a good understanding of what the study is going to do, and on that they make a decision as to whether they want to participate. And sort of it's not quite the same in data science. So currently the law is that unless data is identifiable or private, you don't need consent to use it. So this is really clear with models built on anonymized Facebook data, right? I think a lot of the controversies that have come up recently are because people's data are being used in a way that they don't want it to be used. So we don't really have this informed consent component really clearly. And I suppose the problem with informed consent in sort of the land of big data is that it might not be feasible to get sort of consent from millions of users. But this doesn't mean we can do away with it completely and use that as an excuse. So I think, there are ways around it, right? You can, poll a sample of people who might be affected by an outcome to sort of assess the ethical implications. So it's almost not an excuse. And I think while obviously polling a sample isn't direct consent, it's sort of better than nothing. So obviously, in addition to issues around privacy and personal data, another key issue when we talk about responsibility is bias. So as humans, we're intrinsically biased. There are hundreds of types of cognitive bias that we have. And because our data kind of reflects the world that we live in, our systems tend to be biased in the same way. And it's sort of not always pretty, right? For example, with Google Translate, if you type in certain words like doctor and professor, they auto-translate to a male form, versus if you type in nurse, they auto-translate to a female form. This isn't something that Google Translate is doing on purpose. It's coming from our biases in our society that sort of exist. And obviously, in addition to biases in data, there's also bias that can come from ignorance. So, lack of diversity in development teams mean you're not selecting the right training data, or you're making rules that aren't quite right. And then there's, bias that's introduced deliberately, but we're not really going to talk about that. So assuming, these biases creep in sort of unintentionally, it's very much our responsibility to account for them. So, you can do things like during development, testing systems to see how predictions differ based on biases that we already know about. And then this also kind of ties back into the explainable AI that we were talking about earlier. So if we can explain a decision process, it might help us uncover these biases and enable us to start sort of combating them essentially. So realistically, biases are going to arise in our system, and it should almost be our default assumption that they're there, and our default way of working should be to try and find them and mitigate them. So obviously, there's a lot of issues around bias and trust and data security, and to sort of, in response to this, companies have started creating codes of ethics or Hippocratic oaths around data science. So there's an example of one from Data for Democracy. So they talk about a lot of things we're talking about. So combating bias and putting people before data. And they're great, but what do they actually mean? So the issue with these codes of ethics is often that they're general principles that no one would really disagree with, but they're also not enforced. So it's still very much up to ourselves to hold ourselves accountable. And I think there's also sort of a potential unintended dark side to these codes, because they can be used as sort of a sign of morality to say, look, we've got this great code, and then you just continue doing exactly what you were doing before without changing anything. So it's sort of, we want to try and avoid that and make sure that the accountability sort of lies with us, and we ensure we're behaving ethically ourselves as opposed to relying on codes and Hippocratic oaths. So I think they mentioned in the keynote this morning that lots of computer science courses are actually starting to teach an ethics component, and a lot of data scientists are actually self-taught, which is, you know, quite cool as a thing in a profession. So there's actually, you can self-teach ethics in data science. There's loads of courses on Coursera and other platforms like that, which I think is quite cool. So I think we are moving towards a place where this is becoming, it's sort of coming to light, and people are making the effort in this area. So I kind of like to think that including ethical sort of considerations in your work will become as commonplace as including comments in your code and stuff like that.
Cool. So, we've both got clickers, so we're fine with it at the moment. Basically, what we're talking about is instilling human values. So it's thinking about how would you want to be treated. If you're at the kind of tail end of an algorithm that's been designed and you're one of the people that's being negatively affected by it, what is it that you would want the people that made it to actually have thought about and to have done and actually speak about? Do you want them to actually hold their hands up and take responsibility, or do you feel okay about it? And you need to flip it around onto that side. So we build all these amazing things. They're super cool, and it's really, really exciting to get to work in such progressive areas and see sort of our reality changing so quickly. But actually, if we're not careful, we may lose our sort of more human side and our more empathetic side, because in the race for technology, it's sometimes forgotten. So one of the best descriptions, I think, that's kind of out there about some of the ways that sort of we've been talking and we think about it is actually from Mo Godat, who recently left Google to concentrate on his 1 Billion Happy project. I don't know if everyone's aware of that project. Okay, it's a pretty cool project. I've got a short video clip for it, but it doesn't actually explain the project. So I'll play this now, I'll tell you a bit more about that, because it's super awesome and everyone should get involved.
We don't contain them at all. The best way to raise wonderful children is to be a wonderful parent. It's not the inventor of the technology that's going to set the tone going forward. It's the technology itself that's going to use the knowledge, the values that we communicate to it, to develop its own intelligence. And what are they observing? They're observing a world that's full of greed, disregard for other species, violence, ego, showing off. The only way to get those machines to be not only intelligent, but to also have the right value set, is that we start to portray that right value set today.
Cool. So I think his view is that AI at the moment is like a 3-year-old child. It's a toddler. It's learning from all of its experiences. And if you think about it in that way, it's sort of gathering data about the world, and it gets to see that stuff, which is incredibly negative. And actually as well, when it's built, if we've introduced these biases to it by accident, that's a really sort of bad way for us to be. His project's kind of based on the idea of exponential growth, that if you sort of spread happiness and that you sort of show love, if 1 billion people are happy, you have a chance to actually change the world. And through actually spreading that message, we can kind of exponentially change our society as it is. I would advise you to check it out. He's got some really, really great points on kind of AI. He used to work for, I think it was Google X. So he's very knowledgeable in those areas as well. But again, for us, if we just kind of bring it back to where we started.
Yep, so when we talk about designing ethical artificial intelligence and being sort of human and humanity-centric, we need to just keep in mind fairness and transparency, and enabling these things, enabling trust and working well with machines, but also keep in mind that we're ultimately the ones who are responsible.
And I guess this would be kind of our call to arms. It's no one else is coming. We have a chance to actually affect our companies and affect society much faster than legislation does. If we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. There's a great article by Dan Hon that kind of talks all about this as well, if you want to find out a bit more about how you can sort of do those things for yourself as well. So yeah, that was us.
Okay. We'll take a few questions.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
So, thank you. That's a great talk. Does a great job of explaining what we need to be ethically aware of when developing AI systems. But what do we do about the fact that there is lots of actors with lots of power who are not going to have that in mind? Like government developing AI for autonomous weapons, or like insurance companies maximizing profit instead of like operational finance in who pays how much. not, and legislators are not even aware that it should be. Is it as bad as it seems, and what would you recommend?
I think that is a really, really interesting point. I think one of the keynotes this morning, the lady from the European Parliament was starting to talk about legislation and that they're actually doing sort of sandbox for people to look at blockchain and AI. So some governments are aware of it. I completely agree there are negative actors, I guess we'd call them, who are doing things for nefarious means. But in a lot of ways, I think it really is, if we don't try, who else is going to try? And if we sort of push for that, we can push to change it ourselves, but we also need to push for that legislation and try and, if we're talking in transparent, open ways about what these technologies can actually do, and being open with the public and actually explaining it on human-to-human terms, at least then we give people a chance to actually start having those conversations and make those differences. If we keep it within sort of data science or a technical community, how can we ever expect people to act on it themselves? I think it's like we have such a chance to change it, and it's through the way that we put stuff out there. But yeah.
Yep.
I'd like to second the comment about a really great presentation, and I thought you really got to the gist of it very, very nicely. I'd like to disagree with you on one point.
Okay, go for it.
I totally agree with you that there will be a large number of new jobs created, far more probably than the ones that are eliminated. However, I think we're going to eliminate a lot of job roles in our society very quickly.
Yep.
Over a very short
Yep.
period of time. And the people who are currently filling those job roles do not have skills to take the new job roles. And we are not investing as a society in the reskilling process, not in any country. Well, there's a couple countries on the planet that are trying, but most are not. And the result is going to be a huge social upheaval. And I think we're already seeing the beginnings of it. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
Brexit.
Yep.
There's other instances of protectionist, populist movements that are being driven in large part by people who are not seeing their future employment or have already lost their employment due to automation
Yep.
or whatever. And I think that that's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And I don't think we're taking the societal moves necessary to head that off.
I completely agree. I think that your point about that there will be a loss suddenly and much faster in specific areas is completely right. I think it's we need to think about what we can do about that as well. I think in the Rust Belt in America, there are kind of there's been lots of training schools set up to actually teach kind of minors now about coding, and lots of sort of like tech hubs being done. So actually, there are again things that we can do by even just as a community ourselves, the tech community, trying to retrain people and in areas where we see that it's needed. And I think that we should, in terms of the larger society problems, I totally agree. I don't have any answers on that. I just think that it's not as black and white as that everything will go. There is also, maybe there's the advantage to some and the disadvantage to others, but there is still the positive side of the argument is not necessarily aired as often as the negative one. Yes, yeah, exactly, because we just don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Magical new jobs. AI trainer. It's like a new job. It's a new thing that AI is your pet and you like feed it. Who knows? But yeah, we must have like those sorts of debates of actually where the future of work is going, definitely.
Yeah, I think when we start sort of like, we spend a lot of time, especially working in tech companies, designing, systems to automate things. And we do that and we're like, great, project done, tick. But I think actually a part of those projects should be, cool, we're automating this thing. Also, your other role is to find a solution for this person who's now out of a job. Like, it should just be a standard component of a project.
Yeah,
These two arms,
we call it like organisational
right?
change, which effectively is restructuring. So yeah, it's definitely something that happens a lot, unfortunately. Yes. Drastically shifts, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Cool.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Oh.
You mentioned something
Oh, the Data for Democracy ones.
Yeah, Data for Democracy. I think it's just it's an online community of people basically. They've got a GitHub. I can go back to the slide, maybe actually. I don't know if we can find it.
I can go back to the slide.
Oh no, yeah,
there we go.
It's that one.
Yeah.
So they've got a Slack. They've got a GitHub. So there's the link there, I think.
We'll publish the slide so you can actually see the link as well, because it's probably tiny.
You mentioned that deep learning models are quite poor in terms of explainability. It's quite obvious. So what's the remedy? Do you recommend not to use them in certain cases?
No, so like I think as we very briefly mentioned, there's a couple of models that can be used to sort of interpret a deep learning model, and I wouldn't go into a technical explanation. There's actually a talk by someone on the Lime model tomorrow. I can't remember who it's by, but that's basically a talk on sort of how that model works, and that can be used to sort of it's sort of a linear model around a sort of more complex model, so it helps you just explain a decision, and it's a very sort of like local thing for a certain prediction. But so like that's just an example. But I think there are like ways exist to do it, and I think research should probably we should continue researching in that area. So yeah.
Okay, if you have any more questions, I'm sure Jivan and Hollie will talk to you afterwards. We'll take a short break and we'll reconvene about 2:55. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.